Welcome to episode 12 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. I'm Chris Time Steele, and today I'm happy to share this interview and conversation with Dr. Drucilla Cornell. Drucilla is a leading philosopher and feminist theorist. She currently teaches political science at Rutgers University. She was a union organizer for sex workers, a playwright, a lawyer. She's one of the top living critical theorists and deconstructionists, and is author of many books including Albie Sachs and Transformation in South Africa, From Revolutionary Activist to Constitutional Court Judge, Law and Revolution in South Africa, Ubuntu, Dignity, and the Struggle for Constitutional Transformation, Moral Images of Freedom, A Future for Critical Theory, which won the Frantz Fanon Award in 2007, The Imaginary Domain, A Discourse on Abortion, Pornography, and Sexual Harassment, The Philosophy of the Limit, and many more books. Drucilla Cornell is known for building upon the Kantian idea of aesthetics with her philosophical writings on the imaginary domain, which basically means open space for people to live their lives differently. She is currently working on a book with Jane Anna Gordon titled Creolizing Rosa Luxemburg. In this interview, we talked about her work with seeking to unionize a collective brothel, feminism, Rosa Luxemburg, philosophy, revolutions, Ubuntu, and nihilist fascism. Thank you to Awareness for the music. Please check out this jingle from The Final Straw, part of the Channel Zero Network.
The Final Straw is a weekly anarchist radio show. It's fucking awesome, and you're never going to hear me say fucking awesome on our show because we're FCC regulated.
There's a black part of my heart that just flutters when you talk like that.
Talk, then more yelling.
It's a weird sort of like nice thing in a way, but also can get kind of crushing at times.
thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org.
Hi, Chris. I'm back.
Okay. How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. It's a great honor, so I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, absolutely. I'm honored, too.
I wanted to ask you about the era when you were running a collective brothel, and you said that you learned how to shoot at this point, and kind of what that era was like and what you gained from that.
This is when I was working as a organizer with prostitutes. Well, just to give you some background, I was part of a consciousness-raising group called Las Granudas, and I was the only white woman in the group, and the group met in the South Bronx, and two of the women in the group were working prostitutes. And we formed what we saw as a prostitutes collective, which would actually work as a collective, and the money would be shared. And we also were very active and involved in the organization and decriminalization of prostitution, because you can't unionize. The prostitutes are seen and viewed by the law as criminals. I actually didn't learn how to shoot at that time. My ex-husband and I were involved with a group called Vincent Ramos that did armed self-defense for the Black Panther Party. And it was, to be a member of Vincent Ramos, you had to learn how to shoot. It was, at the beginning at least, purely a notion of self-defense, not any kind of offensive violence, although some of us felt that Vincent Ramos was going in the direction of offensive violence, and that, for many other reasons, was why both my ex-husband and I left. But it was, to be a member of Vincent Ramos, you had to learn how to shoot a gun, and you had to own several guns. So that's when I learned how to shoot. What happened with the Prostitutes Collective is the pimps came after us. And so we had to engage in our own armed self-defense, and the police were on the side of the pimps. It was a very idealistic move, obviously, to try to form a prostitutes collective. And all of us were at the viewpoint that, once socialism came about, this is the early 70s, we were hoping it might have come about by now, there would be no prostitution. As I'm sure you probably know, Fidel Castro ended prostitution when he came to power, and gave prostitutes their choice of another profession paid for by the government. I still think, actually, the basic program of decriminalization and unionization was right, and that's the position I took about porn workers when there was a huge dispute between First Amendment lawyers and Catherine McKinnon, and I wanted to know, who was on the ground union organizing, and this was way before the internet, and it only took me 24 hours to find the union organizer, a woman named Ona Z, who was organizing around all condom sets. And the great irony, this is, of course, dates this story because this is when there were videos and actual porn sets, but she was organizing on an all condom basis. And the irony is the big First Amendment porn industry defined pornography as a depiction of a male ejaculation. So you couldn't have all condom sets or it wouldn't be pornography anymore. So they were accusing Ona Z's union job of ending pornography. And, it's an interesting question whether, if that's your definition of pornography, it obviously ends pornography. Yeah, she was very suspicious of feminists because the focus was always on Catherine McKinnon versus the First Amendment or pro-pornography feminist. And I always think that the first thing you want to do in looking at any issue is go to the ground and see who's struggling to actually make changes. And in fact, as I said, it didn't take me long to find Ona Z, who, really took her knocks for taking on the porn industry. She was a porn star. She was kind of the Meryl Streep of the porn industry. They had awards and all, the whole 9 yards, and she won all of them. Oh. And she also had a very long life as a porn star. When I met her, she was in her late 40s.
And you were saying that they had defined if it was women pornography, it was called gynecology or something like that back in the porn industry?
Yeah, that was because the definition of pornography, right, is a male ejaculation. Mm-hmm. They saw women like Candida Royale and Ona Z in her own movies as doing quote-unquote gynecology, yes.
I think my next question, I wanted to talk about 9/11, and you've written about the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan who had been fighting the Taliban for 25 years.
Absolutely.
And you spoke about how you were in the streets after this, and you were on your way to adopt a child or children from Afghanistan when the U.S. blew up the orphanage and people tragically found children's hands in nearby trees. Can you speak about this at this time?
I was seriously thinking about adopting a child. I hadn't gotten that far from Afghanistan. And yes, I was told that the orphanage had been where I was thinking of adopting had been blown up. I'm not a reporter, and wasn't in Afghanistan, so I have no proof of that.
And you were writing about you had written about 9/11 at that time and the women in Black movement and those ongoing movements, which was really interesting. Thank you for your writing on that.
Well, a comrade of mine, Ann Snittow, and I formed a group called Take Back the Future, and that began as a group supporting the right of the revolutionary women of Afghanistan to be part of the election in Afghanistan. They weren't allowed to be on the ballot. And our view was, and they were in the United States at the time, that the feminist position was to support them to be on the ballot because they had been leading the struggle in Afghanistan, not just for women, but for democratic rights. But they were also the group that did underground gynecology, that continued education for women beyond the third grade. So they actually had like a government in exile, the same way the African National Congress did in London, in Pakistan. So they were a real organized government and ready to take positions of power. And they were not even allowed to be on the ballot. And a lot of feminists who thought, oh, well, just us, the United States, going in and declaring war on Afghanistan would, quote unquote, free women. Well, we've seen that as a big illusion. So Ann Snittow and I formed this group called Take Back the Future, which then became kind of a feminist peace group and was active throughout the George Bush reign. We were against the war in Afghanistan. We were against the USA Patriot Act, and we were against the war in Iraq. We tried to expand the definition of feminist struggle to include all of those anti-war, anti-militarist positions, but also to do things. We had this giant dragon that we created that was chasing after the Constitution in our actions against the USA Patriot Act. But a lot of other movements wanted us to come with the dragon. There was a group of mainly Islamic residents, most of whom had green cards, being forced to re-register or be questioned, and they asked us to come, so we joined their demonstration, and we did so as a feminist issue. And then there were a group of black women who asked us to come join their movement because their sons were being given the choice between going to war or going to prison, and we saw that as a feminist issue. So we defined feminism as beyond just struggling for the rights of women. Of course, we were for that too, but also that anyone who was pushed below the bar of humanity should be seen as a feminist concern.
Definitely. And during 9/11, I was in high school at this time, and the whole military took over our school after 9/11, and they were just trying to recruit us. They were taking us out to lunch, paying for our lunch. They took over our history classes. They told all of us the men need to be heroes and fight, and that was pretty much how my whole high school panned out for the last 2 years.
Well, it was a very, very scary time. You know, there are two 9/11s. For me, the first 9/11 is 9/11, 1973, when the CIA supported and basically financed a coup against Salvador Allende in Chile. And he, backed himself famously in his office and refused to surrender and took on the army.
Yeah, that was when they brought in the whole University of Chicago economy, people, and Pinochet and the whole
that was certainly obviously after he was killed, yes. This is when you began to hear the rhetoric that capitalism doesn't need democracy. Dictatorship is fine.
Well, on that note, I wanted to move to these two great women philosophers you speak about, which is Sylvia Wynter, who, after was elected, had to run through the forest and was being shot at, and Rosa Luxemburg, you call the greatest female Marxist thinker, who wrote about the mess of revolution, and many things such as the hazy future as well. Can you speak about how you've interacted with their work and how it should be integrated into this current moment we're in?
Well, I'm actually editing a book with Jane Anna Gordon on realizing Rosa Luxemburg. I think that there's no thinker more relevant to the issues of our time than Rosa Luxemburg. First, she speaks about the primitive accumulation of capital necessarily generating war and imperialism. So unlike Lenin, who said that imperialism is the highest state of capitalism, for Rosa Luxemburg, capitalism is imperialistic. It has to be, because it cannot solve its problems of overproduction and underconsumption within one nation. So she's one of the first to really speak about the inherent brutality and continuing brutality of capitalism and its integral relationship to colonization. So she also speaks against certain forms of centralization in terms of Lenin's whole view that the way the party had to be organized. And I have been in a number of Marxist-Leninist organizations. There were democratic centralism, where the Central Committee is sort of the brains, and the cadre are the limbs who carry out the orders of the Central Committee. So she wrote against that because for her, she had what I would call a struggle perspective. And the struggle perspective is that you actually learn from how new forms of organization are created as people are getting organized and changing themselves. And that includes the party. So she completely rejected the notion of democratic centralism. And that was, of course, how she got murdered. She was in the streets with the people in the German Revolution.
Yeah, because they were telling her to hold off initially, right? Like the time isn't right, but she spoke about, well, if the fire ignites, you need to attack.
But for Luxemburg, socialism meant the complete transformation of who we were as human beings. So almost nothing would be left in place. And that's also why she wrote against Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Not that she didn't celebrate the Russian Revolution. She did. She felt that they gave honor, quote unquote, to the international social democratic movement by seizing power. But the moves, as she put it, to confuse necessity, because they were in dire straits, with principle, led them to think that the dictatorship of the proletariat meant reigning basically by terror, and that was exactly what socialists shouldn't do. And so she understood that they were in a very bad position, but on the other hand, they were taking that very bad position and generalizing it into ways in which people as socialists should live their lives. And for her, socialism needed the most sweeping forms of democratic participation imaginable.
And this was the hazy future that she had written about, of when everything was taken down, of learning how to be with each other.
Yes, well, she put it, socialism lies in the midst of the future. All we know is, these are paraphrasing her words, all we really know about socialism is slogans and negative decrees. But when you actually begin to think about transforming how we would live with one another, including with animals, the whole relationship to nature would be changed. So, Lenin, had his formula, the Soviets and electrification, and believed that the discipline of the factory had to remain in place. She completely disagreed with that. Capitalist relations of exploitation had to end, and that meant total transformation of who and how we were together.
Thank you. I can't wait for that book to come out.
Yeah, me either. I'm so excited. We just got a contract yesterday on International Workers' Day, so both Jane and I were thrilled.
That's awesome. I had read Creolizing Rousseau by Jane.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. Now, Sylvia Wynter is a different kind of thinker, but extremely important, because in terms of movements like post-humanism, she shows that really the human hasn't even begun. And in that way, you do see resonances with Rosa Luxemburg, because for man one and man two, these are philosophies of man. They're not philosophies of the human. And man is always defined through, again, white imperialist structures that are inseparable from her, from how we have envisioned who can be called human or quote-unquote man. So the resonance is interesting, because although Rosa Luxemburg is a Marxist, and Wynter is a socialist, and pretty clearly, because she was part of, I think it was Grenada, when it was a socialist government for a while. No question about her politics. Her focus is really on how we cognitively come to be inscribed in these philosophies as a material reality, so that man appears to us as what the human is and can be. So therefore, post-humanists are actually confusing the human with man.
I wanted to talk about, you've taught many classes in revolutionary constitutions. Can you talk about the reality of revolutions and maybe how Greece panned out into this?
What was the last part, Chris?
Can you talk about the reality of revolutions and maybe how Greece can be used as an example of these classes you were teaching on revolutionary constitutions?
You mean Syriza coming into power?
Yes.
There's a wonderful book by another comrade, Kostas Douzenis, who's in the Hellenic Parliament. The problem with using Greece as an example of revolution is that they were almost colonized by the European Union. Any of their attempts to actually make radical changes were pretty effectively blocked. I'm not sure that I would use Greece as a good example of a revolution. I mean, it certainly was an attempt of a revolutionary party to take power and make changes. And I think we'll have to see, what happens down the road.
Yeah, because they were all they're already kind of straitjacketed with debt and IMF and
yeah, very, very
gaps.
much so. And the other thing is, Greece doesn't have a lot of natural resources. So, one of the problems there too was how they could generate any kind of fund from within a situation where they were imprisoned by debt and also didn't have a lot of resources to work with. In South Africa, for example, I think unfortunately the transformation has failed there, but it has a lot of resources. So it has a lot of potential constantly to move to rebuild the infrastructure that was so broken by apartheid. And as Saint-Pierre and Blanche called it, 354 years of indentured servitude and unfree black labor, not just under apartheid. So, I think that I'm with Rosa Luxemburg. I think that ultimately revolutionary struggles would have to be global to really move effectively against capital. But, you don't move from square one to a full global revolution. We have to start from where we are and make the changes that we see are possible. And for me, I admit that means campaigning as hard as I can for Bernie Sanders in the United States.
Starting where you are and then inputting internationalism into that as you go.
Yes, and one of the things about Bernie Sanders is he's, of all of the 5,000 Democrats who are running for president, I was thinking of putting up my dog. So, we wouldn't just have humans. We would have some four-footers running for president. That of all of the people running for president, he's been the most consistent in terms of his bill ending the war in Yemen, beginning to at least challenge the military industrial establishment. And of course, he uses the word socialism. Now, what he means by socialism and what I mean by it may differ, but he certainly put the word socialism on the agenda to the point where Donald Trump in his last State of the Union address has to say, America will never be socialist. Well, nobody ever said anything like that because it never occurred to anybody. And then people like Elizabeth Warren have had to say, oh, no, I'm a capitalist. So he's actually put the socialism versus capitalism on the agenda. So as much as I agree with Rosa, as she put it, the Bolsheviks could pose the question of socialism, but they couldn't answer it. And of course, both Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin desperately hoped that the German Revolution was going to succeed, and with that, the revolutionary flame would take up most of Europe, and we obviously know that didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to join the struggle where you are. And I think that the worst thing is to be cynical and say, oh, well, there's no point in joining this struggle and joining that struggle, because they're not truly revolutionary. I mean, this move by some thinkers like Alan Badu and even Jody Dean towards, we need democratic centralism and all we can do is be faithful to the prior events of revolutionary action because real transformative work doesn't happen. I'm with Rosa. All there is real transformative work. And yes, you want to seize power at some point. And yes, you want to totally transform the economy, but that you have to join the struggles that are there for you to try to make change now.
Yeah, instead of diving back into sectarianism or nihilism and those things.
Yes, and the move back towards Leninism and towards democratic centralism and the need for these great phallic figures. I mean, come on. Enough of that. We've seen how that worked out. It didn't work out.
Yeah.
Who knows what would have happened if Rosa Luxemburg had not been murdered and gone into the river?
I know. And I guess the next point I'd like to go to is you said in a talk that we need to look at experiments in the global south and for white people to stop focusing on what fucked up things that white people did. And I was wondering if you could talk about some experiments in the global south that you think we should pay attention to, whether it's the Zapatistas or what Spivak's doing with the rural schools in India.
Well, the Zapatistas and Spivak are very different. The Zapatistas are a movement, indigenous peoples within Mexico. They're not intellectuals. And this is in no way to criticize Spivak schools, but Spivak schools are very different than an indigenous movement claiming autonomous territories and engaging in all sorts of battles for constitutional reform in Mexico. I mean, one is a fighting organization and already has claimed and successfully autonomous space in Mexico. Spivak schools are really a very different order. And again, this is not to criticize Spivak schools or say they don't play an important role, but it's a very, very different kind of organization. In terms of focusing on how white people have screwed up, I'm with a recent paper that Lewis Gordon wrote called Reimagining Liberation. And what he argues, and I'm with him, is that it doesn't really do much good for white people to take a moralistic as opposed to a political position like, oh, you know, we've had all this privilege, as if them giving up this privilege would do anything. Like right now in Flint, Michigan, people don't have clean water. Well, if you know, what do? Try to make sure that in New York City we don't have clean water? No, the answer is you got to go to Flint, Michigan and support the struggle there for clean water. So he makes a distinction between moral responsibility and political responsibility. And when white people get moralistic about their privilege, it often, ironically, leads to no political action. So instead, he's advocating, and I'm totally with him, that white people take political responsibility and the actions that follow from political responsibility to get involved and to make change.
Mm-hmm. And he's spoken about how that recenters whiteness in a way as well, when white guilt becomes the talk.
It's what?
That it recenters whiteness when white guilt becomes the talk of the panel or something, rather than working on what you're saying, these issues in Flint.
Exactly. And I mean, that doesn't mean that there isn't white skin privilege. You know, I've distinguished between identity, identification, and position. And in a racist society, I'm positioned as a white woman. And as an identity, I grew up with being, the definition of woman was cannot do, including white women. We couldn't be anything. Not lawyers, not police, not fire people, not soccer players. We couldn't do anything. So being a woman had a very clear definition, can't do it. And that's, of course, changed because of feminism and activism. So that I grew up and have an identity as a woman. But identifications are more fluid, and I think that a lot of people have gotten confused about the difference between position, identity, and identification. Linda Alcoff has a wonderful book called Visible Identities, which talks about the fact that identities actually appear and materialize. It's not something you can just step out of. And Lewis's paper is called Reimagining Liberation.
I guess this question is similar. It's about, I know you're not fond of the word decolonization. And when I spoke to Lewis Gordon, he spoke about the need to decolonization studies. And you've also written about the colonization of critical theory. I was wondering if you could speak about issues with decolonization. You argue that it's a mistake to walk away from European philosophy for Africana and that we need to find relationships and dialogues between the two.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't think we should completely reject European philosophy. I mean, shifting the geographies of reason doesn't mean that there's no place to read Foucault or Derrida or Nietzsche or Heidegger or Kant or Hegel, and certainly not Marx. Here I'm with Lewis. Decolonization is a process, and if you read Fanon's chapter on the dangers of nationalization and nationalism in The Wretched of the Earth, he makes it very clear. There's a wonderful paragraph that this can't happen under capitalism. So decolonization is a process that lies as much in the midst of the future as socialism does, and the two are connected. So again, using Lewis's distinction between moral and so-called moral responsibility or moral breastfeeding and political responsibility, decolonization is a process, and I would maybe emphasize even more that it's a process that has to be tied to socialism and to socialist struggle. And you can't just simply say, oh yes, well we can decolonize and have capitalist relations, or, you know what, I mean, we have to get rid of all of the people who aren't truly indigenous. And what does that mean? What are we going to do? Give people DNA tests? We're going to be like, you know, Elizabeth Warren and going around to see if we're truly like indigenous? I mean, that's not what decolonization is about. I mean, South Africa does have the biggest white population at 7.8% of the population. Of course, a lot of the economic resources remain in the hands of the white ruling class. That's part of the reason the transformation has failed. But throwing them out of the country isn't the solution either, because most of them have nowhere to go, because the whole thing of who Afrikaners were is a complicated history. But secondly, that the politics of decolonization and socialism are going to have to foreground anti-black racism, no doubt about it. That if you turn this into like some young people in South Africa who are white, who have called for their suicide. I mean, young white people committing suicide is neither here nor there, and that's part of the problem. And this Lewis has so right of turning a decolonization into some kind of pure moral end, as opposed to a complicated political process. And it doesn't mean that there doesn't have to be reparations, and it doesn't mean that there doesn't have to be the expropriation bill, which finally got passed. All those things need to be done. There has to be the complete economic reworking of South Africa in the direction of decolonization and socialism. And what those words mean together will be part of a struggle. We don't really know. But sometimes what happens in the decolonization movements now, decolonization becomes sort of like a moral, purified end. And I'm with Lewis on this. When you turn it into that, it loses its revolutionary power. I'm not really for words that are like decolonization. You know, I mean, we have to find a more affirmative word, radical transformation, in the sense that Luxemburg meant. It's much closer to my heart. She wrote from the standpoint of the metropole. There's another great quote by Fanon where he says the masses of Europe have to wake up and stop being Sleeping Beauty. Well, she certainly woke up, and she certainly paid the price for taking on militarism and imperialism from within the metropole. But no, Rosa did not write from within the global South and the process of decolonization and the fight against anti-black racism, although for her, clearly socialism meant the entire end of the military-industrial complex. No more armaments, so therefore no more colonies.
Yeah, and even Fanon had wrote about this atmosphere of violence, and that even if you were to get rid of the colonizer, the anti-black racism would still be present.
Yes, I mean, Fanon was very aware, and, you know, for Luxemburg, the main form of violence that she knew about and experienced was the defensive violence of workers in mass movements and what she called the mass strike, which were both political and economic. And for her, the two always were moving back and forth from one another. There was no radical separation between the political and the economic. So the violence she saw was mainly self-defense. And that's in part because, again, she was an outsider. She was a Polish Jew, certainly an outsider in Germany. But she never wrote, as Fanon did, from within the perspective of the wretched of the earth.
Yeah, and you often see in a lot of these new discussions that people are seeking to disregard Hegel because of his white supremacy writing, or Kant for his anthropology lectures. But one thing I really valued about your book on the moral imagination was that you use Kant so much, and with the imaginary domain, and you brought out these pieces that were so integral to being used for liberatory theory.
You have to read these thinkers. I mean, there is a lot in Kant's whole notion of the third critique, and the idea that the great ideals are aesthetic, that somebody like Luxemburg picks up on. So that's why there's part of what I'm calling a struggle perspective. They're not something that you can turn into objects and say that this is true or false or morally right or wrong. So to just take these great thinkers, or to take Hegel, Science of Logic, which materializes spirituality, which many of the great African socialists pick up on both Hegel and Kant. Nkrumah wrote a whole book on Kant. So the idea that you just take these thinkers and throw them away is not what creolization is about. Creolization is about putting these thinkers into a different framework, one which certainly challenges their Eurocentric biases, but on the other hand, does not necessarily at all say that you shouldn't read these thinkers at all.
Moving to South Africa, I was wondering if you could speak about the Ubuntu project and now the Ubuntu Township project, that you helped start these two projects and what current projects they're working on.
But I started the Ubuntu project in 2003, the same year the Caribbean Philosophical Association was founded, interestingly enough. And the Ubuntu project began as a project on the ground in the townships because at that time, white academics had no interest in Ubuntu. Now, that came much later. So I actually formed my work group through being kind of in despair and talking to my daughter and a family friend who was traveling with us about how nobody wanted to study Ubuntu of the white academics I was talking to, with a few exceptions, and including Bernard Lotigan, who was the head of the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study and supported the Ubuntu project from the beginning. So I was kind of despairing in a group of young Black South Africans that, well, they knew about Ubuntu. So the project began in the township of Kayamande, and it began with interviews where we actually looked at the so-called cynicism that was being expressed about why Ubuntu was no longer relevant. It was either conservative, young Black people didn't believe in it anymore, it was misogynist. So we took those kinds of questions and turned them into interviews. I had no experience doing this, by the way, and they didn't either. They weren't professional academics or interviewers. Some were thinking of going to college. Only one was actually going to college at that time. So we were kind of hit and miss. But what we did do is we organized two groups. One was a vegetable growing group, which would help provide free vegetables to the school, high school, which was built brick by brick by the people of Kayamande, and then also a sewing collective, which our goal was to have the sewing collective actually go to market and be able to market goods. Goal ultimately came that we would form an Ubuntu Women's Center, which never happened because we were kind of outsmarted by a non-ANC city council, but that was our goal. And so it had a very strong on-the-ground beginning. In the course of the interviews, I interviewed a Sangoma, who's a high spiritual leader in South Africa, and she said if I wanted to learn about Ubuntu, I should come work for her as her assistant, which I did, and she was right. I learned more about Ubuntu from working as her assistant than anywhere else. The project had a very, very strong on-the-ground beginning, and it continues to have that. We have very good relationships with the Gay and Lesbian Sangoma Association, the Shack Dwellers movement. We actually spent some time with the Shack Dwellers, one of the leaders, Mabogo, who was in the Ubuntu Township project. But we also, this is one of the controversial things, argued that Ubuntu should be reconstitutionalized. And thinkers that I respect very much, like Professor Ramosa, disagrees that a African ethical and philosophical concept like Ubuntu can be integrated into what he sees as a European constitution. I have more of a creolizing perspective, and in fact, Ubuntu was reconstitutionalized, and there is now an Ubuntu jurisprudence. And that's one of the very controversial aspects of the project. I still hold that that was the right thing to do, but, again, that's a political question, not a moral question. And the Ubuntu Project continues to hold events. We were to have a 15-year celebration last year, and the Venda students went on strike. And, of course, we don't cross picket lines.
And I saw the documentary.
Oh, you did. Yeah, now I have and that movie, by the way, was produced, acted, written, and directed by young Black and white South Africans. I put up the money to produce it, but it was entirely done by them.
I love the spoken word in it. It was so good throughout. And
it's still taught all over South Africa.
So my next question is sticking with South Africa. And I was It was from the perspective of from a U.S. perspective, what we can learn or unlearn about gender and sexuality from South Africa. You've mentioned before that it's just as Zulu to be lesbian, gay, and transgendered as it is to be heterosexual.
But that's a quote from a wonderful book by the leader of the gay and lesbian Sangoma. Because if you believe in spirit and ancestor possession, then if you're a primary ancestor who possesses you as a man, then you would be in your earthly body a woman, then you could easily relate to another woman. And so the gender dictates of heterosexuality are, from the perspective of the gay and lesbian Sangoma, really a creation of European gender ideas. So Nkunzi is mainly possessed by a male ancestor. And when she's possessed by a male ancestor, we would say she's transgendered because she takes on the features of masculinity. But she would just say she's possessed by a male ancestor. And when she does have a female ancestor who possesses her at times, and then her body actually changes. So the rigid gender roles that we have come from a whole secular ontological worldview that is not necessarily African at all. So the quote, it's as Zulu to be a lesbian as it is to be heterosexual, is from her. And then there's also another wonderful book called The Invention of Woman. I forget the author's name now, but making similar points.
My next question was your article you did with Stephen Seeley on the 7 Theses on Trump. And,
oh, right.
I was wondering if, can you speak about fascism currently in the U.S. and the world, and also that we are facing for perhaps the first time fascism rooted in open nihilism?
One of the things that Stephen and I wanted to say there is that the kind of authoritarianism of Trump is rooted in a neoliberal capitalist nihilism. And so it almost mimics the appeal to the glory of the great nation, make America great again, of course, was his slogan. At the heart of it is this emptiness, which is that the values of what it means to be a citizen of the United States have been so evacuated and moved towards these notions of neoliberal individualism. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to both talk about why this kind of fascist mobilization is possible, but also how it's different. I remember that Hitler proclaimed himself to be a socialist. In order to fight for fascism, he had to say he was a socialist. That's the last thing that you're going to be hearing from Donald Trump. You know, instead, what Donald Trump is saying is America is never going to be socialist because of having to respond to Bernie Sanders. But it's much more that we wanted to point to is that these, and Ernst Bloch does this well in The Heritage of Our Time, is that people long to be part of something big, something with dignity. And the evacuation of values and just this ascendancy of the social media and this kind of every person for themselves of neoliberalism leads to a kind of totalitarian response. I mean, Hannah Arendt indicates something like that, certainly in non-totalitarianism, where loneliness and disconnection leads people to move in the direction of some sense of belonging to something that's great, and that it's a longing for dignity.
Yeah, and you've spoken about how capitalism, of course, forces us to compete and atomizes us, and then social media just makes that even a more miniature example, such as trying to get more friends on Instagram or Twitter or likes, and it recompartmentalizes competition even more.
I'll be honest with you, I don't tweet and I don't do any social media stuff. Probably not the best to talk about social media. I'm not on Facebook. I don't do LinkedIn. I'm kind of a dinosaur when it comes to all of that. But yes, I think that the way social media works is almost to break down human-human connection. I mean, how many times have you gone to a restaurant and seen people having dinner together, each on their own phone?
Oh, it's every day.
I know. It's scary.
Mm-hmm.
I, by the way, have a rule in my house. that nobody can be on the phone during dinner.
Hey, that's a good rule.
I think so too. It means that people have to talk about what they did that day to each other.
Yeah, conversations are so important and engaging with each other. Can't lose that.
No, I completely agree. So that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to sort of, we wrote that article, by the way, the day after Trump was elected. So we both wanted to alert people to the fact that, yes, he is mobilizing a kind of fascism, but he's doing it in a way that is different because there's no investment really in anything. And he knows that. And that's what he's so good at doing, or a speechwriter, is mobilizing the sense that we're going to be, the biggest phallus on the planet. I mean, that's where it appeals to a white masculinity that feels like it's completely lost its place. There is no industrial working class anymore in the United States. I mean, we just had General Motors laying off 1,600 workers. I mean, that was the middle class, the industrial unionized working class. That's what the CIO did. And so Trump is promising these ideals that people are starving for. People starve for ideals as much as they starve for food. And he gets that somehow or another. Or somebody around him gets that. His speechwriter clearly gets it.
Yeah, it's this masculine, romanticizing storytelling.
That's right.
My last question ties into the implications of this, which I think one of the worst is, along with having children in cages, is these environmental destruction that this is bringing. And in your essay, Imagining a World Without the Violation of Animals, you speak about the need to respect the wider ecosystem, and then you quoted Derrida of, we're in the need of mutation of our understanding of humanity, and kind of where we're currently going with our environment and what this new era will mean.
Well, one of the things that I loved about Rosa Luxemburg is Rosa Luxemburg certainly saw transformation, as including transformation of our relationships to animals. And I wrote about this in the keynote I gave at the Luxemburg Shift Tune last spring, but also in a recent event at the Goethe Institute. I mean, she saw that the way we exploited animals, I mean, she even had a relationship to wasps. I mean, and insects. She really, because she was a trained botanist. She was educated as a botanist before she became a revolutionary. She saw the whole ecosystem working together. So for her, socialism was never going to be just like in Lenin's, the Soviets before he repressed them all, and electrification. It was always going to be about changing the entire relationship we have to the ecosystem. And again, and Trump's whole thing about big game hunting, and it's this fantasy masculinity that he's putting into place about people having decent jobs. So people say, and Ernst Bloch and the Heritage of Our Times is great on this issue. Why do people go against their class interests? Because clearly Trump's budget is against everybody's interest except for a handful of billionaires. I mean, why is anybody for this budget? And the answer is because it promises people this fantasy of being the man. And if you look at the State of the Union addresses, there are always these little warrior tales. This person patriotic, this person did this person did that. But there were little warrior tales. And it's cheering us on to think that we can be, the baddest bully on the block. When everything else has been evacuated, that has appeal.
But thank you so much for speaking with me today, Dr. Cornell.
Oh, it was great, Chris. I'm very honored. Well, the real lesson is don't lose hope. The only thing we can do is continue to try to fight for a more just world. That's our political responsibility.
Yes, and not to dive into nihilism, as you said, or being cynical and
there's
sectarianism.
so much. Yeah, there's so much of that around right now.
Yeah, there is.
And it's a time when academics should be so clear about their political responsibility. You have movements such as Lee Edelman that we answered in There's Nothing Revolutionary About a Blowjob, which the article I wrote with Stephen, You know, where all politics is heteronormative, or Afro-pessimism, where all politics is just belying the fact that blacks are caught in social debt and there's nothing they can do about it. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
But it's a socioeconomics to that, because that makes you undangerous. You're never going to get fired for that. You can get fired for tweeting about Palestine, but you cannot get fired for saying that there's no point in any movements of African Americans in this country to fight against their oppression, or for anyone under the element to fight for socialism and a better world, because it's all heteronormative.
Yeah,
those people get tenure.
That's disgusting.
Because they are totally not scary.
Yeah.
Pessimism is a socioeconomic way to climb in the academy at this time, when we never needed more real critical engagement.
Mm-hmm. When I was teaching history, I was working on an article about the J20 defendants after the Trump inauguration, when they were charged with up to 65 years in prison for destroying a window, allegedly. And I was cautioned by my chair that I shouldn't write about that, because maybe some of them were guilty and I could be writing a fallacy in my article. And I was like, no, I'm interviewing the J20 people. No one deserves to be in a cage for 65 years, being held by grand juries.
Well, you have a lot of guts and courage, and I really admire you for doing this podcast. I know the word now. I didn't even know what it was like a week ago, but now I do. So I'm coming out of being a total, I don't want to say dinosaur, because dinosaurs are a very successful species, but, you know, everything. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for checking out the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. Big shout to Awareness for the Music. Please share the show around, rate it, and we also have a Patreon, patreon.com/timetalks. Peace.